Murder in the Moonlight Garden, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 1. A party in the twilight. Narrator. There is a particular quality to the light in St. Mary Mead during the twilight hours of a summer evening. It is a light that softens the edges of the world, blurring the lines between the familiar and the secret, between a well-tended rose and a lurking thorn. It is a light that promises mystery. And on the evening of the annual Moonlight Garden Party at the old Hambledon estate, that promise was to be fulfilled in the most dreadful way. The party was a brainchild of the new owner of the estate, a Mr. Julian Croft. He was a man of indeterminate middle age and independent means, who had arrived in our village some 6 months prior with a flurry of renovation and a cloud of pleasant, but vague, anecdotes about his past. He had restored the Hambledon Gardens to a state of magnificence not seen in a generation, and this party was his debut, his way of introducing himself to the upper echelons of local society. I had been invited, more out of my family's long-standing connection to the county than my own social standing, and I had brought with me my dear friend and neighbor, Miss Jane Marple. She was, as ever, dressed in a soft, dove-gray gown, a simple black lace shawl about her shoulders. She carried no fan or cocktail glass, only her own 2 keen eyes and a mind that catalogued human folly with the precision of a botanist classifying rare specimens. We stood on the terrace, looking down over the gardens as the last of the sun's rays gilded the tops of the ancient yew hedges. Below us, lanterns were being lit, their warm glow beginning to punctuate the deepening blue of the evening. The air was heavy with the intoxicating perfume of night-scented stock, tobacco plants, and the heady, almost decadent fragrance of the moonflower, a rare and spectacular bloom that was the centerpiece of the evening. "It is all very beautiful, is it not?" I remarked. "Oh, yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet. "Beautiful, and so very carefully arranged. It puts me in mind of Mrs. Allerton's drawing-room. Every cushion perfectly plumped, every book precisely aligned. One always felt one was disturbing a work of art by merely sitting down. Such perfection so often conceals a frantic desire to control, and control, as we know, is so often a response to fear." Her words, as usual, held a deeper meaning that I would only later comprehend. Her gaze was not on the breathtaking floral displays, but on the guests, a collection of the county's notable and notorious. "Observe," she murmured, her eyes shifting subtly. "Our host." Mr. Julian Croft was a study in polished charm. He moved through his guests with an easy grace, his smile never wavering. But Miss Marple saw what others did not. "Notice how he constantly touches his signet ring," she pointed out. "A nervous habit. And his eyes, while they smile, are constantly scanning, assessing. He is a man playing a part, and he is terrified of forgetting his lines." Then there was a guest of honor, the formidable Lady Maggie Hartley. A widow of immense wealth and glacial poise, she was the undisputed queen of the local social scene. She held court near the Moonflower Arbor, a tall, imposing figure in silver-gray silk. She was speaking to a young, strikingly handsome man named Stephen Vale, a poet and, some whispered, a professional charmer. "And there," Miss Marple continued, her gaze settling on a third figure, "is the source of so much of the tension." This was Mr. Lawrence Finch, a lean, sharp-faced man in his 50s with the weary eyes of perpetual understudy. He was Lady Hartley's business manager and, it was widely known, her intended husband. He stood a few paces behind her, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand. His expression won a barely-concealed resentment as he watched her converse with the captivating Mr. Vale. "He reminds me so much of Mr. Calthrop, the old schoolmaster," Miss Marple mused. "He waited 20 years for a promotion that never came, and the bitterness settled into his very bones. Mr. Finch has waited a long time for his prize, and he sees it slipping away into the hands of a younger, more attractive man." The final piece in this human chessboard was a quiet, unassuming woman named Miss Catriona Webb, Lady Hartley's personal secretary and companion. A woman of such profound quietness she seemed to absorb the sound around her. She was arranging a shawl over the back of her employer's chair, her movements efficient and silent. "And poor Miss Webb," Miss Marple sighed, a note of genuine pity in her voice. "The glue that holds the entire enterprise together, and the one who is most often overlooked. She is like the wallpaper in a grand room. Everyone sees a pattern, but no one truly looks at it, until, Of course, the paper begins to peel. As the moon rose, a brilliant silver coin in the velvety sky, the party reached its zenith. The lanterns glowed, laughter rang out more freely, and Mr. Croft, beaming with pride, called for everyone's attention. "My friends," he announced, his voice carrying across the enchanted garden, "the moment has come. The Selenisserias grandiflorous, the queen of the night, is about to unveil her glory. The blooms open for but a few precious hours. Please, gather round the arbor and witness a true miracle of nature." A wave of excitement passed through the crowd. We all moved towards a magnificent arbor, a domed structure thickly covered with the dark green vines of the moonflower. Dozens of large, cream-white buds, tightly closed, hung like sleeping bats. The air was thick with anticipation and their potent, lemony scent. We stood there, a hushed congregation in the moonlight, waiting. The only sounds were the crickets and the soft rustle of silken linen. Minutes stretched. Then a collective gasp went up as the first bud began to stay. With a slow, almost magical unfurling, the petals began to peel back, revealing a stunning, intricate white flower that seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was a breathtaking spectacle. One by one, the flowers opened, transforming the arbor into a cathedral of luminous white. Lady Hartley, captivated, took a step closer, then another, drawn into the very heart of the arbor to better admire the central, most spectacular bloom. She leaned in, her silver-gray dress merging with the moonlight and the flowers. And then she stumbled. It was not a dramatic fall. It was a slow, graceful crumpling, as if her strings had been cut. She sank to the mossy ground at the base of the arbor, her head coming to rest gently against a wooden post, as if she had simply decided to take a rest amidst the beauty. For a moment, no one moved. It was so peaceful, so quiet. Then Miss Webb, her face a mask of sudden, intuitive dread, let out a small, choked cry and rushed forward. "Margaret, my lady." She knelt, reaching for her employer's wrist. Her fingers sought a pulse. Her body went rigid. She looked up, her eyes wide with a horror that reflected the moonlight, and found the gaze of Mr. Lawrence Finch. She's... Miss Webb stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Finch pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his face pale. "Maggie? Good God! Man, do something!" he barked at Julian Croft, who stood frozen, his whole smile replaced by a look of utter shock. It was then that Miss Marple, who had remained on the periphery, spoke. Her voice was low, but it cut through the panic like a knife. "I would not touch her if I were you," she said. "Look!" She pointed a delicate, slightly trembling finger. There, on the lapel of Lady Hartley's silver-gray dress, just over her heart, a single, glowing petal from the magnificent moonflower had landed, and beside it, almost invisible against the shimmering fabric, was a tiny, dark, metallic pinprick of a stain. The queen of the night had bloomed, and in doing so, she had borne witness to a perfect and perfectly silent murder. Part 2, the scent of suspicion. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet warning was more deafening than any scream. It was a silence thick with unspoken questions and dawning horror. The beautiful, moonlit scene had frozen into a grim tableau, the glowing white flowers, the elegant guests turned to statues, and at the center of it all, the still, silver-clad form of Lady Hartley, with that single, accusing petal resting on her breast. Mr. Lawrence Finch was the first to break. He took a jerky step forward, his hand outstretched as if to brush the petal away, to deny the evidence of his own eyes. "What are you talking about, you foolish woman?" he snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of grief and fury. "She's fainted. The heat, the excitement." "The heat has long since left the evening, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her voice retaining its preternatural calm. She did not move from her position, but her eyes, sharp as tacks, were fixed on the tiny, dark stain beside the flower petal. "And I fear this is something far more permanent than a fainting spell. Dr. Hayward is here, is he not? Perhaps he should be summoned." Her words acted as a catalyst. The spell of shock was broken, replaced by a flurry of frantic activity. Someone did, indeed, rush to fetch old Dr. Hayward, who had been enjoying a quiet whiskey in the library. Julian Croft, his face ashen, began shepherding the other guests back, his voice a strained, repetitive murmur. "Please, everyone, back to the terrace. Give her some air. I'm sure it's nothing." But it was not nothing. We all knew it. The air itself had grown cold and heavy with the knowledge. Dr. Hayward arrived, his medical bag in hand, his kind, wrinkled face set in grim lines. He knelt beside Miss Webb, who was still crouched by her employer's side, her body trembling violently. His examination was brief, professional. He checked for a pulse, lifted an eyelid, and then sat back on his heels, removing his spectacles to wipe them slowly with a handkerchief. "I'm afraid," he began, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and started again, louder, for the benefit of the hovering, terrified crowd. "I'm afraid Lady Hartley is gone. It appears to be a heart attack, a sudden, catastrophic failure." A collective, shuddering sigh moved through the remaining guests. A heart attack. It was a terrible but natural explanation. It was an anchor of normality in a sea of burgeoning dread. One could understand a heart attack. One could file it away under tragedy rather than terror. But Miss Marple was not looking at the doctor. She was looking at Mr. Croft's face, and she saw not shock, but something else, a fleeting, unmistakable flash of relief. It was gone in an instant, replaced by an appropriately grave expression, but she had seen it. She then turned her gaze to Lawrence Finch. His initial anger had dissolved, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. He was staring at the body not with the grief of a lover, but with the bleak despair of a man who has just seen his life's investment vanish into thin air. And Miss Marple's eyes softened with pity. The secretary was not looking at anyone. Her gaze was locked on the dark stain on the silver-gray silk, and her face was a mask of such pure, unadulterated terror that it seemed to radiate from her small, hunched form. It was then that the police were called. Inspector Miles, a competent, weary-looking man from Much Benham, arrived with a young, keen-eyed constable. The official machinery of death began to grind into motion. The garden, so recently a scene of enchantment, was now a crime scene. The lanterns that had provided such a romantic glow now cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the proceedings. Inspector Miles took initial statements, his manner efficient and slightly skeptical. He listened to Dr. Hayward's assessment with a nod. "A tragic business," the inspector said, closing his notebook with a sense of finality. "The excitement, the strain on an elderly heart, it's a story as old as time. We'll need a formal statement from you, Doctor, and from you, Mr. Croft, as a host." But it seemed straightforward. He was ready to wrap the tragedy in bureaucratic paper and seal it away. But once again, it was Miss Marple's quiet voice that introduced a discordant note into his symphony of closure. "Inspector," she said, stepping forward from the shadows near the terrace. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity, but before you conclude your investigation, might I draw your attention to a small detail?" Inspector Miles turned, his patience visibly thinning. "Miss Marple, is it? I appreciate your concern, but I think the medical evidence is quite clear." "Oh, the medical evidence is undoubtedly clear on the effect," she agreed pleasantly, "but it is often silent on the cause. That small, dark stain on Lady Hartley's dress, just there, by the left shoulder. You see it." The inspector sighed but leaned in, peering at the spot she indicated. The constable shone a torch on it. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible mark, like a drop of oil or a speck of rust. "It's nothing," the inspector said. "A spot of damp, perhaps. A smudge from the garden." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded. "But its placement is so very specific. And do you know, it reminded me of a case many years ago involving the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. She had a beautiful cashmere shawl, you see, and one day she found a similar tiny stain on it. She thought it was a flaw in the wool, but it turned out to be a minute droplet of a particularly potent and fast-acting wood stain remover which a housemaid had accidentally spattered. The housemaid was, at that very moment, using it to remove a stain from a piece of furniture she was secretly selling to pay off a debt. The point is, Inspector, the smallest, most insignificant mark can sometimes point to a much larger and far darker story." Her anecdote, seemingly so trivial, hung in the air. The inspector frowned. He was a practical man, but he was not a fool. He recognized the steel beneath the old lady's gentle rambling. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone more serious now. "I am not suggesting anything," Miss Marple said. "I am merely observing that Lady Hartley was a woman of immaculate grooming. For a stain of any kind to be on her person at such an important event is curious. And then there's the matter of the pin." "The pin?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes now scanning the ground around the body. "A small silver pin, I should think. The kind a lady might use to secure a corsage or an ornament. You see, Inspector, that moonflower petal did not simply float down and land on her dress. It was pinned there." She gestured towards the arbor. "The flowers are above her. If a petal had fallen, it would have landed on her head, her lap, the ground around her. For it to land perfectly flat and centered on the vertical plane of her bodice, over her heart, it defies both gravity and chance. It was placed there, and I would wager that the tiny stain you see is not from the garden, but from the pin that held it, a pin that has now, rather conveniently, vanished." The constable, without waiting for an order, immediately began a careful search of the mossy ground, his torch beam sweeping back and forth. Inspector Miles stared at Miss Marple, his earlier impatience completely gone, replaced by a dawning, grudging respect. The peaceful heart attack had just been complicated into a potential murder. The moonlit garden was no longer just a backdrop for tragedy. It had become the stage for a chilling, deliberate act. And in the darkness, surrounded by the ghostly, fragrant blooms, the hunt for a killer and a missing silver pin had truly begun. Part 3. The Tarnished Silver. The library at the Hambledon estate was a room designed for quiet contemplation, its walls lined with leather-bound books that smelled faintly of beeswax and forgotten years. On this night, however, it had been transformed into a command post. Inspector Miles had ordered all the principal guests to remain, and here we were, a collection of shocked and suspicious individuals under the unforgiving glare of the electric chandelier. The moonlit garden outside the tall windows now seemed a world away, a beautiful eye hiding an ugly truth. Miss Marple had been offered a worn leather armchair near the fireplace, and I sat beside her. She appeared small and fragile amidst the room's masculine opulence, yet her presence was a gravitational pull that the inspector seemed unable to ignore. The initial, official theory of a heart attack had been thoroughly dismantled by her simple, devastating observation. The hunt was now on for a silver pin, and for the mind that had used it as a weapon. Constable Peters, the young officer, entered the library, his face alight with a thrill of discovery. In his gloved hand, he held a small, clear evidence bag. Inside it, resting against the plastic, was a slender, vicious-looking silver hat pin, about 3 inches long. Its tip was darkened with a dull, metallic stain. "We found it, sir," the constable announced, his voice tight with excitement. "Tossed into the base of a boxwood shrub, about 10 yards from the arbor. It was caught on some leaves, otherwise we might have missed it entirely." Inspector Miles took the bag, holding it up to the light. The room held its breath. "And the preliminary test?" he asked. "Positive, sir," Constable Peters replied. "The tip is coated with a concentrated alkaloid toxin, fast-acting, through the bloodstream. Dr. Hayward confirms it would cause paralysis of the heart muscle almost instantly. It would look exactly like a heart attack." A sharp, collective intake of breath filled the room. The abstract horror was now concrete, physical, held in the inspector's hand. Julian Croft sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Lawrence Finch stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I feared his teeth might crack. "So," Inspector Miles said, his voice low and dangerous as he swept his gaze across the assembled faces, "we are no longer dealing with a tragedy. We are dealing with a calculated, cold-blooded murder. Someone in this room plunged his pin into Lady Hartley's back during the distraction of the flowers blooming, pinned that petal to her dress as a macabre signature, and then discarded the weapon." His eyes fell first upon Lawrence Finch. "Mr. Finch, you stood to gain a great deal from Lady Hartley's death, did you not? Her will, I understand, is quite favorable to you." Finch's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a desperate fury. "I loved her," he insisted, though the words rang hollow in the tense room. "We were to be married. Why would I destroy my own future?" Perhaps because your future was not as secure as you pretended, the inspector countered coolly. We will be looking into your finances, Mr. Finch. Deeply. He then turned his attention to Julian Croft. And you, Mr. Croft, this event was your grand introduction. A very public death of a prominent social figure on your property. It's a kind of scandal that can ruin a man. Or, perhaps, it was a convenient way to resolve a private matter. What was your relationship with the deceased? Croft looked up, his face a mask of bewildered innocence. Relationship? We were acquaintances. Cordial, nothing more. She was a guest, an honored guest. This is a nightmare. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disheveling it. His performance was convincing, but I saw the calculation in his eyes, the same calculation Miss Marple had noted earlier. Then, the inspector's gaze landed on the most fragile of the group. Miss Webb, you were closest to her. You would have had the easiest opportunity. And as her confidential secretary, you would know the precise contents of her will. Did you perhaps feel underappreciated? Were there promises made that were not kept? Catriona Webb looked as if she might dissolve into the Persian rug beneath her feet. She shook her head, her lips moving soundlessly. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of sheer, undiluted terror, not grief. It was then that Miss Marple made a small, almost imperceptible sound. She was not looking at the pin in the bag, but at Miss Webb's hands, which were frantically pleating the fabric of her simple gray dress. More specifically, she was looking at the brooch fastened at the neck of that dress. It was a small, inexpensive piece, a silver lily with a tiny, fake pearl at its center. Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, breaking the tense silence. Might I see the pin for a moment? The inspector, somewhat surprised, handed her the evidence bag. She held it carefully, not opening it, but studying the pin through the plastic. She then looked back at Miss Webb's brooch. It is a curious thing, she mused, almost to herself. The workmanship. This hat pin is quite plain, you see, functional, but the head is a simple, smooth silver bowl. And Miss Webb's brooch, if you look closely, Inspector, the lily has a small, looped stem at its base. It is meant to hold a pin which appears to be missing. The room froze. All eyes turned to Miss Webb's brooch. She instinctively clutched a hand over it, her knuckles white. It broke, she stammered, her voice a thin wire of panic. Weeks ago. The pin fell out. I lost it. Did you? Miss Marple asked, her tone not accusatory, but deeply curious. Or was it reproposed? The pin from your brooch would be of a similar length and weight, would it not? And so much easier to obtain and to explain than a separate, more conspicuous hat pin. Inspector Miles took a step towards Miss Webb. Is this true, Miss Webb? Is a pin from your brooch missing? The woman looked like a cornered rabbit. She glanced wildly from the inspector to Miss Marple, to the damning evidence bag. The weight of the suspicion was crushing her. I don't know. I don't remember, she cried, her composure shattering. It could be, but I didn't do it. Why would I? She was my life. But even as she denied it, the circumstantial evidence was weaving a tight noose around her neck. The opportunity, the access, the missing pin from her own jewelry. It was a narrative the police could understand. A trusted servant, pushed too far. As Inspector Miles began to press her more intensely, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, a faint line appearing between her brows. She was not watching the confrontation. She was watching the others. She saw the subtle, relieved slump in Julian Croft's shoulders. She saw the grim, satisfied glint in Lawrence Finch's eye as a focus shifted away from him. She had provided the key that unlocked one door, but in doing so, she had seen two others swing slightly ajar. The case was far from solved. In fact, it had just become infinitely more complex. Someone in this room was not just a murderer. They were a master of misdirection, and they had just allowed the most vulnerable among them to take the first, terrifying step towards a gallows. Part 4. A web of motives. Suspicion, once given a face and a name, takes on a terrible life of its own. In the oppressive silence of the library, it swirled around Miss Catriona Webb, thickening the air until it was difficult to breathe. The missing pin from her brooch was no longer a trivial detail of a broken piece of jewelry. It was a centerpiece of a narrative of cold-blooded betrayal. Inspector Miles, his earlier weariness replaced by a relentless focus, circled her. "Let us talk about this brooch, Miss Webb. When exactly did this pin go missing? Weeks ago is rather vague." Miss Webb flinched, her fingers still clenched over the silver lily at her throat. I can't recall the exact day. It was before the party was announced." "Was it?" The inspector pressed, his voice deceptively calm. "So, you have been walking around with a broken, insecure brooch for weeks? A woman in your position, so meticulous in her duties for Lady Hartley, yet so careless with her own attire? It seems out of character." "I meant to have it repaired," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I simply forgot." "You forgot?" Inspector Miles let the words hang, heavy with disbelief. "And this pin, the specific pin that you lost, just happened to be the precise instrument used to murder your employer. A remarkable coincidence, would you not say?" Julian Croft, who had been watching with a kind of horrified fascination, suddenly interjected. "Inspector, this is almost distressing, but surely you can see the poor woman is beside herself. Is this really necessary?" His tone was one of gentlemanly concern, but Miss Marple, observing from her armchair, noted how his eyes darted between the inspector and Miss Webb, assessing the damage, calculating the fallout. Lawrence Finch, however, saw an opportunity. The focus was off him, and he leaned into it with a venomous relief. "I've always said there was something shifty about her," he declared, his voice cutting through the room. "Oh, that quietness. Hiding in plain sight. Maggie trusted her implicitly, gave her everything. And this is how she's repaid." He shook his head, a portrait of righteous indignation. "She knew about the new will. You see, she knew Maggie was planning to reduce my share and set up a charitable trust. Catriona was to be the trustee, with a modest stipend. She must have decided modest wasn't enough." This was new information. The inspector's head snapped towards Finch. "A new will? When was this drawn up?" "Just last week," Finch said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "The solicitor, Mr. Accolay, has the documents. Maggie told me herself. She felt Catriona needed more purpose, a legacy beyond just being companion." He made the word companion sound like a form of servitude. The motive was now taking shape, and it was powerfully financial. Miss Webb, faced with a future of diminished personal importance and a stipend, had acted to prevent it. It was a story that made a brutal, logical sense. But Miss Marple's mind, ever the labyrinth, was turning down a different corridor. She was not listening to the words as much as she was listening to the music behind them, the subtle harmonies of resentment and the discordant notes of a lie. "Inspector," she said, her soft voice once again cutting through the tension, "might I ask Mr. Finch a question?" Inspector Miles, now thoroughly convinced of the old lady's value, gave a curt nod. "By all means." Miss Marple turned her gentle gaze on Lawrence Finch. "This new will, Mr. Finch. It must have been a terrible blow to your own expectations. Lady Hartley was reducing your share, you say, after so many years of devoted service." Finch's face tightened. "My devotion was not conditional on her wealth, Miss Marple." "Of course not," she replied, her tone utterly sincere. "But it does make one wonder. If Miss Webb had a motive to prevent the new will from being enacted, well, so did you not? In fact, your motive might be considered rather stronger. For you, it was about losing a fortune. For Miss Webb, it was about a change in the nature of her purpose. One is a concrete loss, the other a more abstract one." She let the implication settle. Finch spluttered, his carefully constructed composure cracking. "How dare you? I was in love with her." "Love and money," Miss Marple sighed, "are so often intertwined, are they not? It reminds me of the eldest son of the Parker family. He professed such love for his ailing father, but when the old man changed his will to leave the bulk of his estate to a local museum, that love turned to something much darker, much more desperate." She then turned her attention back to the brooch. "There's another curious point about this brooch," she mused, almost herself. "Miss Webb, you say the pin has been missing for weeks. but I recall seeing you at the village fete just last Tuesday. You were wearing this very brooch, and I distinctly remember noticing it gleaming in the sunlight. It seemed perfectly secure then. I remember thinking what a pretty, modest piece it was. Miss Webb stared at her, a flicker of confusion and hope in her tear-filled eyes. Are you quite certain, Miss Marple? Inspector Miles asked, his interest sharpening. Oh, yes, she said calmly. My eyesight is not what it was, but I am very observant of details. It is a habit of a lifetime. The brooch was intact on Tuesday, which means a pin was lost, or perhaps removed, sometime between then and this evening. The timeline had just dramatically narrowed. The murder was not the result of a long-held, simmering plot tied to a weeks-old broken brooch. It was a decision made in the last few days, a reaction to a more immediate, more urgent pressure. The focus in the room shifted again, becoming less certain, more volatile. The simple story of the vengeful companion was unraveling, revealing a more complex and ugly tapestry beneath. Miss Webb was still the most obvious suspect, but she was no longer the only one with a powerful, timely motive. Inspector Miles looked from Finch's furious face to Croft's nervous one, and finally to the terrified, trembling form of Miss Webb. The case, which had seemed so close to being solved, was now wide open once more. The Moonlight Garden had not just witnessed a murder, it had cultivated a whole garden of poisonous motives, and Miss Marple was only just beginning to identify the weeds. Part 5. A Shadow in the Garden. The rain began to fall, a gentle weeping against the window panes, as if the night itself mourned the corruption it had witnessed. Inside the library, the atmosphere was electric. Miss Marple's simple observation about the brooch had thrown a wrench into the smooth, convenient machinery of Miss Webb's guilt. The timeline was now a critical factor, and it cast everyone's actions of the past few days in a new, sinister light. Inspector Miles, his earliest certainty shaken, turned his attention back to Julian Croft. "Mr. Croft," he began, his tone measured but firm, "this party was your creation. The guest list, the arrangements, the placement of the moonflower arbor, all of it passed through your hands. Is there anything at all, about the planning or the evening itself that struck you as unusual? Any unexpected deliveries? Any staff behaving oddly?" Julian Croft wrung his hands, a picture of distressed hospitality. "Inspector, I've been over it in my mind 1,000 times. It was all perfectly normal. The flowers were delivered yesterday from Greengage Nurseries. The staff are all local, vetted." He trailed off, then his eyes widened slightly, although there was one small thing. Probably nothing. "Let me be the judge of that," the inspector said. "It's the under gardener," Croft explained. "A young man named Benji Stokes. He's a good worker, but a bit simple. He's devoted to the gardens, especially the moonflowers. He was almost possessive of them. This afternoon, I found him near the arbor, not working, just staring at it. When I asked him what he was doing, he jumped like a frightened rabbit and mumbled something about protecting the ladies. I thought he meant the flowers. But now, the implication was clear. A simple-minded young man, obsessed with the flowers, perhaps developing an unhealthy fixation on the elegant Lady Hartley. It was a sordid but plausible twist. "Where is this Benji Stokes now?" Inspector Miles asked, his interest piqued. "He lives above the old stables," Croft replied. "I sent all the staff to their quarters when you arrived, as you requested." The inspector nodded to Constable Peters, who immediately left the room to fetch the undergardener. The focus had shifted again, this time away from the drawing room and down to the servants' quarters. Miss Webb, for a moment, seemed to breathe slightly easier, though the terror in her eyes had not abated. It was then that Miss Marple, who had been unusually quiet, spoke again. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the rain-streaked window as if she could see right through the glass and into the dark, wet garden beyond. "Protecting the ladies," she repeated softly. "What a curious turn of phrase. It reminds me of a boy we had in St. Mary Mead many years ago. His name was Jem. He was simple, too, and he had a powerful, chivalrous instinct. He would follow the vicar's daughter on her walks, not with any malice, but because he believed it was his duty to guard her from imaginary dragons. He once attacked a perfectly harmless tourist who he thought was looking at her funny. The intention was pure, but the action was dangerously misguided. She turned from the window and looked directly at Julian Croft. "Mr. Croft, you said the moonflowers were delivered yesterday. Did Benji help with their installation in the arbor?" "Why, yes," Croft said, slightly taken aback. "He helped old Mr. Higgins, the head gardener. He was most insistent on handling them with the utmost care." Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed something. "And the pin, Inspector," she continued, turning her lucid gaze upon him. "You said it was a common hat pin, but the tip was coated with a toxin. A simple undergardener would have knowledge of plants, perhaps even of their poisonous properties. But would he have the knowledge, or the means, to coat a pin with a concentrated alkaloid? That seems to me an act of more sophisticated preparation." Before the inspector could respond, the library door opened and Constable Peters returned. He was alone. His expression was grim. "Is gone, sir," the constable reported. "His room is empty. A small bag and his good coat are missing. It looks like he's done a runner." A fresh wave of shock, this time tinged with a grim satisfaction, rippled through the room. Flight was as good as confession in the eyes of many. "There, you see," Lawrence Finch exclaimed, a note of triumph in his voice. "The simpleton did it. He became obsessed. She rebuffed him, and he killed her in some twisted fit of passion. It's the only thing that makes sense." It did make a certain, brutal sense. The puzzle pieces seemed to snap into place. The fixation, the opportunity, the flight. Inspector Miles immediately began barking orders, organizing a search of the grounds and alerting surrounding districts. But Miss Marple did not look satisfied. She had a small, vertical line between her brows, a sign of deep concentration. She rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window, peering out into the rain-lashed darkness. "He is running," she murmured, so quietly that only I could hear. "But is he running from his crime? Or is he running from something else? Fear is a powerful motivator, my dear. And sometimes the most obvious suspect is simply the most convenient one to frighten." She turned back to the room, her voice clear and purposeful. "Inspector, before you devote all your resources to hunting that poor boy, might I suggest we examine the moonflower arbor one more time? In the light of this new information, and with the rain perhaps washing away crucial evidence as we speak." Inspector Miles, though eager to pursue the fleeing Benji, recognized the wisdom in her request. "Very well, Miss Marple. But quickly." A small procession was formed. The inspector, Constable Peters, Miss Marple, and myself, with a reluctant Julian Croft leading the way with a powerful electric torch. We ventured back out into the sodden night. The beautiful party was a ghost now. The lanterns were extinguished, the chairs and tables abandoned. The garden was a landscape of shadows and the steady hiss of rain. We reached the arbor. The magnificent moonflowers, battered by the rain, were already beginning to close, their glorious, brief life spent. The white petals were turning brown at the edges, looking bruised and sorrowful. Constable Peters played his torch beam over the ground where Lady Hartley had fallen. The moss was churned up by many feet. "It's no use, Miss Marple," the inspector said, his voice tight with frustration. "The scene is completely compromised." But Miss Marple was not looking at the ground where the body had been. She was looking at the base of the arbor itself, at the dense foliage of the moonflower vines. She pointed a steady finger. "There, Constable," she said, "shine your light just there, if you please. Behind that main post." The constable directed the beam. Tucked deep into the greenery, almost invisible, was a small, dark object. Using a pen, he carefully fished it out. It was a man's handkerchief, damp with rain and mud. But it was what was embroidered in the corner that made Julian Croft gasp. The initials, neatly stitched in dark blue thread, were J.C. That's mine," Croft stammered, his face draining of all color. I must have dropped it earlier." "Were you in the habit of stuffing your handkerchief deep into the foliage of your prize flowers, Mr. Croft?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deceptively mild. "Or does its placement suggest it was used for something one would not wish to be found holding, such as, perhaps, wiping a poison-tipped pin clean before discarding it into the bushes?" The rain fell. The torch beam trembled in the constable's hand, and Julian Croft, the charming, polished host, found himself trapped in the light, the monogrammed evidence of his presence at the scene of the crime lying like a lead weight in the constable's gloved hand. The shadow of guilt had shifted once more, and it now fell squarely and terrifyingly upon him. Part 6. A Broken Alibi. The return to the library was a far more somber procession than our departure. No one spoke. The only sounds were the squelch of our shoes on the polished floor and the relentless percussion of the rain. Julian Croft walked like a man going to the gallows, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the monogrammed handkerchief that Constable Peters carried before him like a holy relic of sin. Once we were all inside again, the door clicking shut felt like the ceiling of a tomb. Lawrence Finch watched Croft's disintegration with a hard, satisfied glint in his eyes. Miss Webb had shrunk further into her chair, as if hoping to become invisible. The dynamic of the room had shattered and reformed in an instant. The host was now the prime suspect. Inspector Miles did not sit. He stood before the fireplace, a solid, unmovable pillar of the law, and placed the evidence bag containing the handkerchief on the mantelpiece. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the discovery to press down on Julian Croft. "Well, Mr. Croft," the inspector began, his voice low and dangerously calm, "you have some explaining to do. You told us you found Benji Stokes near the arbor this afternoon. You told us the staff were all vetted and reliable. You presented yourself as a gracious, slightly bewildered host. But this," he gestured to the handkerchief, "this tells a different story. It places you not just near the arbor, but actively concealing something there. Would you care to revise your account of the evening?" Croft's polished facade had crumbled completely. He looked like a frightened boy, his face pale and slick with a nervous sweat. "It isn't what it looks like," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Yes, it's my handkerchief, but I didn't use it to wipe any pen. I dropped it earlier, during the party. And you just happened to drop it in the most inconspicuous spot possible, shoved deep into the very vines where the murder occurred." Miles's skepticism was a physical force in the room. "No, I mean, yes. I was showing Lady Hartley the structure of the arbor, the craftsmanship. I leaned in. It must have fallen from my pocket. I didn't even realize it was gone." It was a weak excuse, and everyone in the room knew it. A man like Julian Croft, so conscious of his appearance, would surely notice the loss of a monogrammed accessory. "And why?" Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Were you and Lady Hartley discussing the craftsmanship of the arbor, Mr. Croft? I was under the impression that your interaction with her this evening was, as you said, merely that of a host and an honored guest. A discussion about joinery seems unusually intimate for such a relationship." Croft floundered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I was just making conversation. She admired it." "Did she?" Miss Marple persisted, her head tilted like a curious sparrow. "Or was there another reason for your private colloquy? A matter of business, perhaps? It is well known that Lady Hartley had a sharp eye for investment, and you, Mr. Croft, have poured a great deal of money into restoring Hambledon. Money from where, exactly?" The question hung in the air, more deadly than any direct accusation. It struck at the very heart of the mystery, Julian Croft's own mysterious past and finances. The inspector seized on this new line of inquiry. "Is that what this was about? Croft? Was Lady Hartley a creditor? An investor? Did she discover something about your affairs that threatened to expose you?" The pressure was too much. Julian Croft sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. All right, he mumbled, his voice muffled. "She wasn't an investor. She was my aunt." A stunned silence blanketed the room. Even Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Your aunt?" Inspector Miles repeated, incredulous. "My mother's younger sister," Croft confessed, the words now tumbling out in a desperate rush. "We were estranged for years. The family, there was a scandal. I was the black sheep. I came here, to Hambledon, to start over. She found out. She came to the party tonight not as a guest, but to confront me. She threatened to reveal my true identity to everyone, to tell them about the past I've been running from. It would have ruined me here, just as I was starting to build a new life. So you had a powerful motive to silence her, the inspector stated flatly. No, I didn't. We argued, yes, privately, before the guests arrived. But we reached an understanding. She agreed to keep my secret, for old time's sake, for my mother's memory. I had no reason to kill her. He looked up, his eyes desperate and red-rimmed. You have to believe me. Why would I kill her after she'd just agreed to stay silent? It was a compelling argument, but Miss Marple was already weaving this new thread into the tapestry. An understanding, she murmured. How very convenient that the only other person who could confirm this understanding is now dead. She turned to the inspector. It does, however, explain the initial flash of relief I saw on Mr. Croft's face when Dr. Hayward proclaimed it a heart attack. He wasn't relieved she was dead. He was relieved that her death was natural, and that his secret would die with her. His panic set in only when murder was suggested. She looked back at Croft, her gaze penetrating. This argument you had, where did it take place? In my study, Croft said, pointing vaguely toward the west wing of the house, just before the party. And the handkerchief, the inspector pressed. If you dropped it at the arbor while showing her the craftsmanship, that would have been during the party, after your argument and your supposed understanding. So your interaction was more than just a brief, reconciliatory moment. You were still engaged with her, publicly, at the scene of the crime. Croft opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing he had trapped himself in a contradiction of his own making. His alibi was in tatters. He had motive. He had opportunity. And now, his own property placed him definitively at the scene. The case against Julian Croft was formidable. Yet, as I watched Miss Marple, I saw that familiar, thoughtful line between her brows. She was not looking at the broken man in the chair, but at the silent, watchful faces of Lawrence Finch and Catriona Webb. She was seeing the whole board, and she knew that the most obvious move was not always a winning one. The killer was in this room, but whether it was a terrified host, the vengeful fiancé, or the betrayed companion, the final truth remained hidden, like a deadly bloom waiting for the right moment to open in the dark. Part 7. The Unmasking. Despair has a sound. It is a hollow, hopeless rasp of a man who sees the walls closing in. That sound now came from Julian Croft as he huddled in his chair, the monogrammed handkerchief damning him more effectively than any sworn testimony. Lawrence Finch watched him with the grim satisfaction of a rival who has finally triumphed. Even Miss Webb seemed to view him with a kind of horrified pity. The case, it appeared, was solved, but the gentle, rhythmic clicking of needles from a corner of the room was a persistent reminder that the final word had not yet been spoken. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and smoothed her skate, her movements calm and deliberate. All eyes turned to her, drawn by the quiet authority she commanded. "It is a fascinating puzzle," she began, her voice soft yet filling the silent room. "It has all the elements of a classic tragedy, a hidden past, a threatened future, a desperate act. Mr. Croft's story is indeed compelling, and the evidence against him is persuasive." She nodded towards a handkerchief. "But it is, if you will forgive the analogy, like a piece of knitting where the most obvious color has been used to draw the eye, while the true pattern is worked in a more subtle shade in the background." Inspector Miles, though impatient, had learned to respect her process. "You have a different theory, Miss Marple." "I have a question of timing, Inspector," she said. "A simple question. Mr. Croft, you stated that you and Lady Hartley had your private discussion in your study before the party. Yet, you also claim you dropped your handkerchief at the arbor during the party, while showing her the craftsmanship. This suggests two separate, distinct interactions. Is that correct?" Croft, looking utterly defeated, could only nod. "Yes, the first was an argument. The second was a kind of peace offering. I was trying to smooth things over, to show her the beauty I had created here, to prove I had changed." "A peace offering," Miss Marple repeated, her eyes drifting to Lawrence Finch. "How very interesting. Because that does not align with what you told us earlier, Mr. Finch." Finch, who had been savoring Croft's downfall, stiffened. "What are you talking about? I never said anything about their interactions." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, a faint smile touching her lips. But you did. You were standing quite close to Lady Hartley and Mr. Croft during that second interaction at the arbor, were you not? I saw you myself. You were watching them with an expression of profound irritation. Yet, when questioned, you claimed to have had no knowledge of any particular connection between your fiancé and our host. You presented their relationship as one of distant cordiality. Why would you lie about that, Mr. Finch? A flicker of panic crossed Finch's face. I didn't think it was important. I was jealous, I suppose. I didn't like the way he was fawning over her. Was he fawning? Miss Marple inquired mildly. Or was he, as he says, making a peace offering? Your lie, you see, makes Mr. Croft's story seem more suspicious. It makes it appear as if he is inventing a second, closer interaction to explain the handkerchief. But if you confirm it happened, then his story gained credibility. Finch's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The noose, which he had been so deftly tying around Croft's neck, was suddenly looking uncomfortably loose. Miss Marple pressed her advantage, her voice gaining a sharper edge. And then there is the matter of the handkerchief itself. When Constable Peters discovered it, you, Mr. Finch, were the one who immediately identified its significance. You said, and I recall your exact words, that's his. How did you know it was Mr. Croft's, Mr. Finch? The initials J.C. were mud-smeared and barely visible, tucked deep inside the foliage. No one else in the room recognized it. But you knew, instantly, almost as if you were expecting it to be found. The silence in the library was now absolute, broken only by the hammering of the rain. Finch had gone very pale. It was a guess, he stammered. Was it? Miss Marple's gaze was relentless. Or did you know it was because you were the one who placed it there? She turned to address the whole room, her logic unfolding with the precision of a master craftswoman. Consider this. The murder was too neat, too clever. The use of the pin, the placement of the petal. It was theatrical. It was the act of someone who wanted to create a story. Mr. Croft, if he were the killer, acting in a panic to protect his secret, would have been far messier. He would not have paused to pin a flower petal to his victim's dress. Her eyes settled on Finch. But you, Mr. Finch, you are a man of narratives. You deal in perceptions and futures. You saw your future, a wealthy, titled future with Lady Hartley, slipping away because of her new will. You couldn't stop her from changing it, but you could ensure the old will, the one that favored you, stood, and you saw the perfect opportunity. A mysterious host with a hidden past, a simple-minded gardener who could be frightened into flight. You had the perfect scapegoat. She took a step toward him. You took the pin from Miss Webb's brooch, not weeks ago, but today, in the confusion of the party. You coated it with poison you had procured, perhaps under the guise of a household pesticide. You followed Lady Hartley to the arbor, and in the moment of wonder as the flowers bloomed, you struck. You then wiped the pin clean with a handkerchief you had previously stolen from Mr. Croft's study during your earlier visit, a visit you made to discuss the very will that was about to disinherit you. You discarded the pin, but you planted the handkerchief, creating a trail that led directly to a man with a powerful, secret motive. Finch was backing away, his face a mask of denial and terror. This is insanity. You have no proof. Don't I? Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The proof is in your own actions, Mr. Finch. The proof is in your lie about their interaction. The proof is in your instant recognition of the handkerchief. But most of all, the proof is in your character. You are a man who loved a woman's fortune more than he loved the woman herself. And that, in my extensive experience of human nature, is the most dangerous motive of all. She turned one last time to the horrified inspector. The truth, Inspector, is not always found in the objects left behind, but in the spaces between a person's words. Mr. Finch did not just commit murder. He crafted a performance, and he made one fatal mistake. He believed he was the only director on the stage. As a final word faded, Lawrence Finch did not confess. He did not break down. He simply stood there, trapped in the brilliant, unyielding light of a deduction, his carefully constructed world lying in ruins at his feet. The storm outside raged on, but the greatest storm in the library had finally and irrevocably broken. Part 8, the final thread. There is a peculiar stillness that follows the shattering of a great lie. It is not a peaceful stillness, but a vacuum, sucking all sound and motion into its depths. For a long moment, Lawrence Finch did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, a marionette whose strings had been cut by the sharp scissors of truth. The polished, urbane facade had not just cracked. It had evaporated, leaving behind a core of pure, petrified fear. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was not a denial, not a protest. It was a low, bitter laugh that seemed to tear itself from the depths of his being. A performance, he echoed, his voice a hollow rasp. He looked at Miss Marple with a kind of terrible, grudging respect. "You saw it all, didn't you? You quiet, meddling old woman." He shook his head, a slow, disbelieving motion. It was a performance. It had to be. It was my masterpiece. Inspector Miles took a cautious step forward. "Lawrence Finch, I am arresting you for the murder of Lady Margaret Hartley." Finch waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. The confession was already tumbling out, not from remorse, but from a perverse pride in his own cleverness, now laid bare. She was going to leave me with nothing. A pittance. After years of listening to her condescension, of managing her tedious affairs, of pretending to be grateful for every scrap she threw my way, she thought she could replace me with a trust and that simpering mouse, Catriona. He spat the words, his venomous gaze sweeping over the terrified Miss Webb. The will was signed, he continued, his eyes glazing over as he relived his scheme. I couldn't destroy it, but I could ensure it was never enacted. I needed the perfect crime. And then, he looked at Julian Croft with a sneer. He arrived. The prodigal nephew, the family scandal. It was a gift. All I had to do was weave the threads together. I took the pin from Webb's brooch when she wasn't looking. So easy. She's so utterly oblivious. The poison? A little something from the gardener's shed, a concentrate used for stubborn ground ivy. Lethal in the right dosage. He described it with the chilling precision of a craftsman reviewing his work. The moonflower blooming was a perfect distraction. The crowd was mesmerized. I was standing right behind her. One quick, sharp push. She barely made a sound. Just a small gasp, lost in the wonder of the moment. Pinning the petal, that was my signature. Poetic, don't you think? That she should be marked by the very beauty she was admiring. His eyes then slid to the evidence bag containing the handkerchief. "And him," he said, nodding towards Croft, so proud of his new monogrammed life. "I took that handkerchief days ago, during one of my many visits to discuss investments. I knew it would come in handy. After I wiped the pen, I tucked it deep into the vines. A little present. I knew the police would eventually search the area, and what a lovely, tidy package it would make. The secretive nephew, caught at the scene." He finally fell silent, his confession hanging in the air like a poisonous mist. There was no rage left in him, only a profound, empty exhaustion. The performance was over, and the audience was not applauding. Inspector Miles completed the formal arrest, his voice steady as Constable Peters moved to secure Finch's hands. There was no struggle. The fight had gone out of him the moment his genius was recognized and dismantled. As he was led from the room, he paused at the door and looked back at Miss Marple one last time. "You know," he said, his voice almost conversational, "I almost got away with it. If not for you, I never would have thought to look for the enemy in the corner, knitting." Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression one of profound sadness, not triumph. "The enemy, Mr. Finch, is rarely a person. It is a lie they choose to live. And lies, like poly-spun wool, always unravel in the end." With Finch gone, the library seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for hours. Julian Croft sank back into his chair, trembling with the shock of his reprieve. "My God," he whispered, "he was going to let me hang for it." Miss Webb began to weep, but this time it was a release of unbearable tension, the tears of someone who has finally been seen as a victim, not a perpetrator. Inspector Miles turned to Miss Marple, his professional demeanor softened by a look of genuine awe. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to say. Your clarity, you saw what none of us could." "I saw a pattern, Inspector," she replied modestly, picking up her knitting once more. "A pattern of human frailty. Greed, pride, Fear. They are threads I have seen woven together many times before, though rarely into such a deadly design. It is a sorry skill to have, but it has its uses. The inspector and his constable began the final, grim paperwork. The rain had nearly stopped now, and a sliver of moon broke through the scattering clouds, its pale light washing the ravaged garden. The mystery was solved, the killer captured. But as I looked at Miss Marple's face, illuminated by the soft lamp beside her, I saw no victory, only a deep, weary understanding of the darkness that can reside in the human heart. The case of the Moonlight Garden was closed. But for Miss Marple, it was simply another completed piece in the endless, complex tapestry of human nature, a reminder that the most beautiful garden can sometimes cultivate the most poisonous of truths. Part 9. The Quiet Aftermath. The departure of Lawrence Finch, flanked by the police, left behind a silence that was both heavy and light, heavy with the memory of his confession, yet light with the lifting of the terrible uncertainty that had plagued the house. The storm had passed, both outside and within the walls of Hambledon, leaving a world washed clean and raw in the pale light of dawn. Julian Croft was the first to break the silence. He rose from his chair, his movements those of a man who had aged a decade in a single night. He walked to the sideboard and poured a generous measure of brandy into a glass, his hands trembling so violently the crystal decanter chimed against the rim. He did not offer a drink to anyone else. This was a solitary medicine for a very private shock. "He was in my home," Croft murmured, staring into the amber liquid as if it held the answers. "Drinking my whiskey, discussing art and politics. And all the while, he was planning to frame me for murder." He drained the glass in one long swallow, shuddering as the fire of the spirit hit his throat. "I owe you a debt I can never repay, Miss Marple." Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting, gave a small, dismissive shake of her head. "There is no debt, Mr. Croft. The truth is a way of wanting to be found. It was merely my task to help it along." Her eyes then fell upon Miss Catriona Webb. The secretary sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the space where Lawrence Finch had stood. The terror had left her face, replaced by a profound, hollowed-out emptiness. "He took it from my brooch," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He must have brushed against me when he brought Lady Margaret her shawl. I felt a tug, but I thought nothing of it." She looked up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, filled with a desperate need for understanding. "He used my pen. He made me a part of it." "He tried to make you a part of it, my dear," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But you are not defined by the wickedness of others. You are defined by your own actions. And your actions last night were those of a loyal and terribly frightened friend. You must remember that." Inspector Miles, having seen Finch into a police vehicle, returned to the library. His official notebook was tucked away, his posture less rigid. He approached Miss Marple. "The formalities are nearly complete," he said. "We'll need signed statements from everyone, of course, but the heart of the matter is settled." He paused, choosing his words with uncharacteristic care. "Miss Marple, in my line of work, one becomes accustomed to the blunt instruments of motive and opportunity. I had forgotten the value of the finer tools. Your assistance has been invaluable." It was as close to an apology and a tribute as a man of his disposition could offer. Miss Marple acknowledged it with a gracious nod. "You are a thorough man, Inspector. The truth would have emerged in time. I merely helped to clear away some of the brush that obscured it." The dawn was strengthening now, painting the eastern sky in streaks of gold and rose. The night's horrors were receding, replaced by the pragmatic demands of a new day. The guests, who had been waiting in a state of suspended animation in the drawing-room, were finally allowed to depart, their cars crunching slowly down the gravel drive, carrying them back to their own lives, forever marked by the events of the Moonlight Garden Party. Miss Webb, with a quiet dignity that surprised me, stood and smoothed her wrinkled dress. I must see to Lady Margaret's things," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "There will be arrangements to be made." She had been a companion in life, and now, it seemed, she would be an executor in death. Her purpose, though tragically altered, remained. Julian Croft watched her go, then turned to the inspector. "And the boy?" "Benji Stokes." Inspector Miles's expression softened slightly. "We found him an hour ago, hiding in the old ice house, half frozen with cold and fear. He wasn't running from police. He was running from the bad man in the library, Mr. Finch. It seems Finch had threatened him earlier, told him he'd be blamed if anything happened to the ladies. The poor lad was just trying to protect himself. It was a final piece of the puzzle, a sad, human coda to the night's malevolence. The simple-minded gardener, caught in a web he could not comprehend. As the first true rays of sunlight streamed into the library, casting long, warm beams across the Persian rug, Miss Marple neatly tied off a yarn and put her knitting away. It was time for us to go. Julian Croft saw us at the door. The grand entrance hall, which had witnessed such glamour and such terror, was now quiet and still. "What will you do now, Mr. Croft?" I asked him. He looked around the vast hall, a complicated expression on his face. "I thought this was a fresh start," he said quietly. "But it seems one can never truly outrun the past. Perhaps it is time to stop running, to live honestly with my own history, however flawed." He offered a faint, weary smile. "The garden will still need tending." Our motor car arrived, and as we drove away from Hambledon, the rising sun set the wet world ablaze with light. The gardens, though battered by the storm, were breathtakingly beautiful, each droplet of water on each leaf and petal a tiny, glittering diamond. I looked at Miss Marple, sitting serenely beside me. "It is a terrible story," I said, "but at least it has a just ending." "An ending? Yes," she agreed, her gaze on the passing hedgerows. "But justice, that is a more complicated harvest. A man will hang, but that will not restore life. A fortune will be dispersed, but it will not heal the betrayal. A village will gossip, and then it will forget. The garden of human consequence, my dear, is one we must all tend, long after the mystery is solved." She fell silent, and I knew she was already turning over the patterns of the night, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a lesson in the eternal and often tragic complexities of the human heart. The case was closed, but for Miss Marple, the quiet, endless study of St. Mary Mead and its inhabitants would continue, one stitch, one observation, one small truth at a time. Part 10. The Garden of Consequences. A week had passed since the tragic events at the Moonlight Garden Party. In St. Mary Mead, time moved at its own unhurried pace, absorbing scandal and shock with the same quiet efficiency as a dry sponge soaking up a spill. The story of Lawrence Finch's arrest was, for a few days, the sole topic of conversation at the post office and over garden fences, but already the edges of the tale were being worn smooth by retelling, becoming just another thread in the village's rich tapestry of local history. I found Miss Marple in her garden, not knitting, but engaged in the more vigorous task of pruning her rose bushes. The morning sun was warm on our backs, and the air was filled with a clean, green scent of cut stems and damp earth. It was a scene of such profound normality that the memory of that rain-lashed night at Hambledon felt like a distant, feverish dream. "The climbers needed a hard prune," she remarked, snipping a dead cane with decisive precision. "They were becoming, wild, tangled. It is so with many things in life, my dear. Without the occasional, sharp correction, they grow out of control and obscure the light." She paused, wiping her brow with the back of a gardening glove. "I had a note from young Mr. Croft this morning." "Oh," I asked, curious, "how is he faring?" "As well as can be expected," she said, her tone thoughtful. "He has decided to stay at Hambledon. He feels he owes it to the memory of his aunt and to the staff to see the estate through this difficult time. He has even asked Benji Stokes to take on a more prominent role in the gardens. It seems the boy's simple, genuine devotion to the plants was the one pure thing to come out of that entire dreadful evening." I felt a surge of relief. So Benji was not in trouble. "Goodness, no," Miss Marple said, a gentle smile touching her lips. The inspector understood the situation perfectly. The boy was frightened, not culpable. In fact, his flight, born of a confused sense of chivalry, ultimately helped to expose a true villain. It is strange how the threads of fate are woven. She moved to the next rose bush, her secateurs snipping with a steady rhythm. "And Miss Webb?" I inquired. "Ah, Miss Webb." Miss Marple's expression softened. She has shown a remarkable strength of character. She is staying on at Hambledon temporarily, at Mr. Croft's request, to help manage the transition. Lady Hartley's will, the original one, is being executed. It seems she has been provided for, not lavishly, but comfortably. More importantly, I think she has found a new sense of purpose. She is no longer just a companion. She is a survivor, and that, I have found, can be a powerful foundation upon which to rebuild a life. We were interrupted by the arrival of the postman, who handed Miss Marple a small bundle of letters. Among them was a copy of the Much Benham Gazette. The headline, while discreet, was unmistakable. Wealthy financier charged in Hartley murder. Miss Marple glanced at it, then folded the paper and set it aside on the garden bench. There was no desire to dwell on the sordid details. "It is a sad business from start to finish," she sighed, resuming her pruning. "A life cut short by greed, another life forfeit to the gallows. And for what? A fortune that brought no one involved any lasting happiness. It puts me in mind of the parable of the rich fool, though I fear Mr. Finch was neither rich nor a fool, merely a man who valued the wrong things with a terrible, single-minded passion." We worked in companionable silence for a time, deadheading the spent blooms and weeding the borders. The physical act of tending the garden felt like a form of cleansing, a restoration of order after chaos. Later, as we took tea at the little wrought-iron table in the shade of a lilac bush, I ventured a question that had been lingering in my mind. Do you think it was the money alone that drove him? Or was it the humiliation? The idea of being cast aside after years of service? Miss Marple poured the tea, her movement steady. "It is rarely one thing, my dear. It is a poisonous cocktail of motivations. The money was a tangible prize, yes, but I believe it was the insult that truly festered. To be replaced in Lady Hartley's affections and plans by charitable trust in a secretary, that was a deep wound to his pride. He saw himself as the architect of his own future, and she was dismantling his blueprint. For a man like Lawrence Finch, that was an unforgivable act. Greed can make a man desperate, but wounded pride can make him monstrous." She took a sip of her tea, her gaze distant. "He was a clever man, but he made the same mistake so many clever people do. He underestimated the quiet people. He underestimated Miss Webb's resilience. He underestimated Mr. Croft's fundamental decency. And he profoundly underestimated the value of simply observing, of understanding the patterns of human nature. He thought the world was a ledger to be balanced. He failed to see it as a garden, constantly growing, changing, and surprising us." As the afternoon wore on, the village continued its peaceful rhythm. Mrs. Bantry called over the fence to discuss the church flower roster. The vicar cycled past, raising a hand in greeting. It was all so ordinary, so safe, and yet, as I watched Miss Marple's eyes quietly noting every detail, every passing interaction, I understood that this was where the real work was done. Not in the dramatic confrontations of a moonlit garden, but here, in the gentle, unending observation of life in all its complex, beautiful, and sometimes tragic variety. The case was closed. Lawrence Finch would face the courts. The lives he had touched would slowly heal and move on. But in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead, the memory of the murder in the Moonlight Garden would remain, not as a scar, but as a lesson, a perennial reminder that beneath the most tranquil surface, deep currents can run, and that it takes a special kind of wisdom to discern their true course. Part 11. The Unseen Seeds. The human heart, much like a garden, possesses a remarkable capacity for regeneration. While the grand drama of the murder at Hambledon would forever be a part of St. Mary Mead's history, its raw, jagged edges were slowly being softened by the gentle, persistent passage of time. A fortnight had passed, and the village had settled back into its familiar, comfortable rhythms, though the memory of the event lingered just beneath the surface, like the scent of rain long after a storm. I was taking tea with Miss Marple in her cosy sitting room. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, warding off the slight chill that had crept into the late afternoon air. Her knitting lay in a soft, grey cloud in her lap, but her hands were still for once, resting atop it as she gazed thoughtfully into the flames. "It is in the aftermath that one sees the true character of people," she observed, her voice barely louder than the ticking of the clock. "Crisis reveals us, but recovery defines us." She had received another letter, this one from Miss Catriona Webb. She read a portion of it aloud to me. "And so, I have decided to take a small flat in Much Benham. Mr. Croft has been most generous, and the legacy from Lady Margaret allows me a modest independence. I find I do not wish to be a companion anymore, Miss Marple. I am taking a course in library science. It seems a quiet, orderly profession, where things have their proper place. I shall always be grateful for your kindness. There, you see, Miss Marple said, setting the letter aside with a satisfied nod. A new beginning. She is no longer defining herself by the person she served, but by the person she wishes to become. That is a very healthy sign. And Mr. Croft? I asked. He has immersed himself in the management of the estate, she replied. I hear he has become something of a recluse, but a productive one. He is consulting with old Mr. Higgins on plans to open part of the gardens to the public on certain days, for a small fee to benefit the Village Hall Restoration Fund. It is his way, I think, of making amends, of connecting his life to the community in an honest, tangible way. He is planting new seeds, both literally and figuratively. She sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. It is the unseen seeds that interest me the most, you know, the ones sown by the tragedy itself. She went on to explain. The scandal had inadvertently strengthened the social fabric of the village in peculiar ways. The shared experience, the collective shock, had broken down some of the usual barriers. Mrs. Bantry had been seen actually conversing with the vicar's wife about something other than church affairs. The local children, who had woven wild tales of a moonlight ghost haunting Hambledon, had been gently corrected by their parents, leading to surprisingly earnest discussions about truth and consequence. Even young Benjy Stokes, Miss Marple continued, a faint smile playing on her lips. He is something of a local celebrity now, not for the reasons Mr. Finch intended, but because his simple, heartfelt devotion to the gardens has been recognized. The other gardeners look out for him. He is no longer just a simpleton. He is Benjy, who loves the moonflowers. A small distinction, perhaps, but a significant one for him. It was then that the conversation turned, as it often did with Miss Marple, to the broader patterns of human nature. Lawrence Finch saw people as pawns, she mused, her gaze returning to the fire. He believed he could move them around the board to suit his own design. But people are not pawns. They are wild, unpredictable things. They have resilience and hidden strengths that can never be accounted for in a May scheme. He understood the calculus of greed, but he failed utterly to understand the algebra of the human spirit. She fell silent for a moment, and I sensed she was thinking of the killer himself. There will be no happy ending for him, of course, she said quietly. The courts will see to that. But one wonders what seeds were sown in his life that led him to such a barren, desperate place. What early influences twisted his character so? It is a sad and lonely path that leads a man to believe that a fortune is worth a life. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long blue shadows across the room. I rose to take my leave, but Miss Marple's final words stayed with me. "We are all gardeners of a sort, my dear," she said, seeing me to the door. "We tend the plot of our own character, and we influence the plots of those around us, whether we mean to or not. We can choose to sow kindness, honesty, and respect. Or we can, like Mr. Finch, sow only for ourselves, and reap a harvest of bitter isolation." As I walked home through the tranquil lanes, the village seemed to hold a new depth. It was not just a collection of houses and people. It was a living, breathing organism, constantly healing, learning, and growing from the experiences it endured. The mystery was solved, the murderer caught, but the story was not truly over. Its echoes would continue to shape the lives of those it had touched, a subtle, enduring legacy in the rich soil of St. Mary Mead. And in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple will continue her watch, ever the keenest of gardeners, observing the endless, fascinating, and often heartbreaking bloom of human nature. Part 12. A pattern completed. The turning of the seasons in St. Mary Mead is a gentle, inexorable process. The vibrant greens of high summer slowly bled into the gold and flame of autumn, and the memory of the Moonlight Garden murder, while not forgotten, had been woven into the village's history, its sharp edges softened by the mundane, comforting rhythms of daily life. The story was now told in hushed tones to newcomers, a local legend with a moral, its details polished smooth by countless retellings. On a particularly crisp October afternoon, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth, I found Miss Marple in her customary chair. The grey wool she had been working on throughout the whole sordid affair was now a finished shawl, draped over the back of her armchair, a complex and beautiful testament to patience and order. In her hands were the beginnings of a new project, a pale yellow wool, soft as a chick's down. She did not speak of murder or motives as I sat opposite her. Instead, she spoke of the village harvest festival, of the surprising quality of Mrs. Bantry's marrow, and of a vicar's slightly over-ambitious plan for the Christmas nativity play. It was a deliberate and gentle return to the ordinary, a reaffirmation of life after death. It was only as the light began to fail, painting the room in shades of orange and deep blue, that she touched upon the closed case, her voice soft and reflective. "The puzzle of the Moonlight Garden is complete," she said, her needles moving in their steady, hypnotic rhythm. All the pieces have been fitted into their proper places. Lawrence Finch awaits his trial, a sad and lonely end to a life warped by avarice and pride. Julian Croft, I hear, is managing his estate with a new humility. And Miss Webb, she wrote to me just yesterday. She has secured a position as an assistant librarian in Much Benham. She says she finds great peace among the stacks of books, a world where everything has its designated place. She paused, her hands stilling for a moment as she looked into the fire. "But you know, my dear, solving a murder is rather like finishing a piece of knitting. One admires a completed pattern. One is satisfied with the workmanship, but one's attention is already turning to the next ball of yarn, the next design. The true constant is not the individual mystery, but the human nature that creates it." I understood then what she meant. The specific players and props of the Hambledon tragedy, the moonflowers, the silver pin, the monogrammed handkerchief, were merely the particular colors used in this one dark pattern. The underlying design, the destructive power of greed, the fragility of reputation, the resilience of the human spirit, was eternal and endlessly repeating. "Will there be other mysteries?" I asked, already knowing the answer. A faint, knowing smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "Oh, I have no doubt of it. St. Mary Mead is not a haven from the world's ills. It is a perfect miniature of it. There will be other passions that overstep their bounds, other secrets that fester in the dark, other lies that require unraveling. The human heart, in all its glorious and terrifying complexity, will always provide the next puzzle." She resumed her knitting, the click-clack of the needles a soothing, metronomic sound in the quiet room. "My task is not to seek out these disturbances, but to be ready for them when they inevitably find their way to my doorstep, or to my attention in the village shop, to observe, to understand, and when necessary, to help guide the threads back to their proper order." Outside, the last of the sunlight vanished, and the room was lit only by the flickering fire and a single lamp. The village of St. Mary Mead settled into a deep, peaceful darkness, its cottage windows glowing like fireflies in the night. The story was over, but life went on, and in her quiet sitting room, Miss Jane Marple, the gentle archivist of human folly and the restorer of fractured truths, picked up her new knitting, her bright eyes missing nothing, her wise heart understanding everything. The case of the Moonlight Garden was closed, filed away in the vast cabinet of her experience. But the great, sprawling, endlessly fascinating mystery of life continued, and she, its most devoted and perceptive student, was content to watch it unfold, one stitch, one day, one small human drama at a time. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, the needles clicked, and in the heart of England, in a village that knew all its secrets and some of its sins, a quiet peace settled, earned, and profound.